fifth graders. So we are kind of ending our year with some stories about American legends. So what we're going to do is we are going to learn about some stories that are told with songs. And we're going to be looking into these legends as well as the songs that help to tell their stories. So the first one we're going to talk about today is John Henry. Now, there are many ways a song can tell a tale. One way is through the lyrics. A poem or song that tells a story with short, simple verses is a ballad. It has a setting, characters, plot, and mood. John Henry is a ballad that tells the story of a man against a machine. And we're going to discover who won the contest and at what price. So first, let's talk a little bit about the legend of John Henry. John Henry was probably a real man who worked as a steel driver on the railroad. A steel driver's job was to drive steel spikes deep into rocks so the rocks could be pulverized and removed, making way for the roadbed on which the tracks were placed. Soon after the steam-powered drill was invented in 1875, a peddler boasted that the new machine could drill faster than any human. John Henry took up the challenge, and legend has it that although he won the match between man and machine, he died afterward of exhaustion. So let's listen to the song, John Henry, and remember that this is a ballad. Now, what is a ballad? It's a poem or a song that tells a story with short, simple verses. So let's listen and find out a little bit more about the story of John Henry.
Steel driver to Lord
So let's see if we can summarize the story of John Henry and the steam drill. Take a minute to think about it. So according to this song, John Henry challenged the captain's steam drill and won. But the effort, in the end, killed him. Now, this song is just one way that John Henry's story has been passed down from generation to generation. But there are also written stories that have been passed down. And I'm going to read a written story about John Henry. So maybe we can get a little bit more out of the story than just what the song told us. The night John Henry was born, the moon was red and the sky was black. The wind howled and the rain poured. Lightning flashed and thunder rolled. Panthers growled and owls hooted, and the Mississippi River ran 1,000 miles upstream. Right on the stroke of midnight, John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand. His daddy looked at him and then looked out at the storm. All this goings on has got to mean something, he said, and I reckon it's telling us that we ain't got no ordinary baby here. We got ourselves a real man. John Henry was awfully big and strong for a newborn baby. He grew fast, getting bigger and stronger every day. As he learned to crawl around the house, his hammer rang out, bang, bang. Soon he was walking, and by the time he was 4 years old, John Henry was big enough to help with the chores. Honey, his mama said to him one day, I know how you love that hammer, but your daddy needs your help picking cotton and hoeing corn, so you're going to have to set your hammer down a while. So here's a picture of the cabin where he was born. John Henry always did what his mama told him, so he hung his hammer up on the wall. Then he stared up at it and he whispered, Mama, I just know that hammer's going to be the death of me one day. John Henry worked beside his father. He weeded and he hoed. He pushed a plow across the fields, and he listened when his daddy told him, if you do a job, son, you may as well do it right. Before long, John Henry had learned to use an axe, a saw, and a chisel. But nothing felt as good as in his hands as a hammer. At last, one evening when he was almost full grown, John Henry went to his daddy and his mama said, You always told me how I was a real man and real men should do what they do best. All this hoeing and plowing ain't natural to me. I gotta find a job where I got a hammer in my hand. His daddy nodded sadly and his mama cried a little. But they both knew John Henry was right. Go on then, son, his daddy said. You gotta find your own way and your own stars so you can be what you're meant to be. So John Henry packed up his hammer and his other belongings and set off. It wasn't long before he had a job as a cotton picker on a large plantation. He picked cotton from dawn to dusk under the blazing hot sun. No one had ever picked cotton like John Henry did. 4,000 pounds a day. After a while, though, he decided he had to move on. The owner begged him to stay and offered to pay him more money, but John Henry only shook his head. Lord knows I don't mind hard work, he said, but I'm a real man and this work ain't natural to me. I need the feel of a hammer in my hand. Down the road a ways, John Henry came to the edge of the great Mississippi River. There he saw a riverboat named the Diamond Joe pulling into port. John Henry stared at it and thought, maybe if I get me a job on the riverboat, it'll carry me far away, someplace where they got a need for a real man like me, a man with a hammer in his hand. So he went straight away and spoke to the captain. The captain took one look at him and hired him on the spot. Any employer would, for years of hard labor, had made John Henry so strong that his legs were as thick as tree trunks. and his arms looked as if they were carved of iron. John Henry's job was to load the heavy cargo on board and to feed the furnace with great shovelfuls of wood and coal. The Diamond Joe sailed up and down the great Mississippi River, past big lively cities and small pleasant towns, past wide green fields and cool dark forests. There were always new places to see, but none of them seemed to have a need for a great man like John Henry. One summer night, John Henry stood on deck and stared up at the sky. He remembered what his daddy had told him when they said goodbye, and he shook his head. "I ain't found it yet," he whispered. "I ain't found the road and the star for me." He looked up at the sky and wondered which of all the stars was his. Suddenly, the Diamond Joe gave a great lurch as the bottom of the boat scraped the riverbed and came to a sudden stop. "We've run aground," the first mate shouted. "She's sinking fast," the captain hollered. "If we don't get her off this sandbar, we're going to capsize." "Captain," John Henry called, "maybe I can push the bow out of the mud." So here's a picture of the Diamond Joe. Then, before anyone on board could blink, he jumped off the boat into the muddy water. The mud came all the way up to his chest, but that didn't trouble John Henry. He just heaved and pushed as the captain shouted, "Full steam ahead!" Slowly, the big riverboat began to move forward. Sorry, my cat's getting into trouble. "Good God Almighty," the pilot cried. "John Henry's pushing us out of the mud." Then John Henry gave one last might heave, setting the Diamond Joe afloat again. When John Henry climbed back aboard, the crew gathered around him, cheering and clapping him on the back. Soon the Diamond Joe pulled into port for repairs, and John Henry decided to wander around town until the boat was ready. He found himself on a high bluff, and looking down he saw a group of men laying a new railroad track. Some men took turns hammering big steel rods into the rock to break it up and make a level bed for the ties. Other men carried heavy steel rails and placed them across the wooden ties. Then others took huge steel hammers and pounded steel spikes into the ties. Sparks flew as steel struck steel, and the hammer strokes echoed through the air. The noise of those hammers sounded like church bells to John Henry. "This is it," he cried. "That's the work I was born to do. Work fit for a real man with a hammer in his hand." He raced down the bluff and asked the track foreman to give him a job. "You ever done any steel driving before?" the foreman asked, looking John Henry up and down. John Henry drew himself up. "I was born with a hammer in my hand," he replied proudly. "This work's as natural to me as breathing is." Before the foreman could say no, John Henry reached down and took up a 12-pound hammer. Then he joined two men who were driving steel rods into the rock. The first man struck the rod with a clang. The second one followed. John Henry raised his hammer high. It seemed like he'd been holding his breath all his life, waiting for this moment. Then he brought his hammer down with a mighty blow, right on the head of that steel rod. With just one blow, John Henry sank that rod all the way down into the rock. The track foreman's mouth fell open. The men standing around swore. The sound of John Henry's mighty hammer stroke echoed through the mountains. "You're hired, friend," the foreman shouted. "I ain't never seen a man who could drive steel like you can." So John Henry became a steel-driving man. Soon everybody up and down the railroad had heard about John Henry, for he was the best steel-driving man there ever was. Finally, he had found the work he was made for. Before long, John Henry found himself a wife, too. She was a slender, sweet-faced woman named Polly Ann, and he truly loved her. "I found my road and I found my star," he told himself, "and it don't seem like there's a thing left to wish for." Yet he still caught himself dreaming of doing something more, something extraordinary, though what that might be he couldn't say. One day, the head of the C&O Railroad sent one of his men to offer John Henry a new job. He had heard all about John Henry and his big hammer. The C&O was building a railroad track through the Big Bend Mountain in West Virginia. It would be the longest railroad tunnel ever made, and they wanted John Henry to do their steel driving. When John Henry saw the Big Bend Mountain, he could hardly believe his eyes. It was the biggest mountain he'd ever seen. He knew that the work would be difficult, but that didn't bother him. So here's a picture of of John Henry's hammer. All he wanted was to hammer all day long and be the best steel driving man in the world. So he took the job. The head of the company was glad. He knew the work would be hard and dangerous, but if John Henry led the way, the other men would follow. Soon work on the Big Bend Tunnel began. First, John Henry and his men drilled deep holes in the mountainside. Then other men, called the Powder Boys, stuffed the holes with dynamite and blew out the rock. So the Big Bend Tunnel slowly began to take shape. Deeper and deeper into the dark mountain the crew tunneled, but none of the men felt afraid, for they could always hear the sound of John Henry's hammer up ahead of them. It sounded like the beating of a strong, steady heart. "Time to blast her out again," the crew boss said one day. The Powder Boys laid in the dynamite and lit the fuse. But as the fuse began burning down, the walls of the tunnel began to rumble and shake. "It's a cave-in!" the men shrieked. John Henry and his crew scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. Meanwhile, the fuse was still burning closer and closer to the dynamite. "Hold on, I'll put her out," John Henry hollered, and he raced to the fuse. He had almost reached it when he tripped and fell. There was no time to get up again. Whop! John Henry threw his mighty hammer. It landed right on the burning fuse a split hair before it reached the dynamite. The flames sizzled out, and the men cautiously rose to their feet. They'd been saved by John Henry and his hammer. "Ain't nothing that John Henry can't do," his men boasted, and a few days later John Henry proved it again. To that day, the crew was hard at work when they heard a strange noise. So here's the dynamite. "What's that, boss?" asked John Henry's friend, Little Bill. "I don't rightly know myself," replied John Henry. Just then a big steel contraption came rumbling down the tunnel behind them, belching smoke and flames. This here's a steam drill," said the man from the railroad office told the foreman, "and it can do more work than any 16 men combined." "I don't know about that," the foreman answered. "I got John Henry here, and he's mighty good." "That's the truth, all right," put in Little Bill, speaking up for his friend. "Ain't no machine in the world that can beat John Henry when his hammer's going strong." All the men cried, "John Henry can beat that thing!" Then John Henry looked at the machine and said, "Yes, sir, I reckon I could." So the railroad boss said they should have a contest the very next day. John Henry and Little Bill against the new steam drill. The word quickly spread, and the next morning 1,000 people gathered to see John Henry race against the new machine. Polly Ann was up in front with her best blue dress. "Don't work yourself too hard, John Henry," she said. "Don't worry," John Henry replied, kissing her for luck. "You watch, Polly. I'm going to beat this thing." With a pistol shot, the race began. The machine screeched to life, and Little Bill positioned his drill. Then John Henry swung his mighty hammer, and as his hammer struck Bill's drill, the air all around sang. Rattling and shaking, the machine blundered through the mountainside, and John Henry replied with stroke after mighty stroke, but it was no good. Through the sparks and smoke, Little Bill could see the steam drill was pulling ahead. The race went on hour after hour, and still John Henry kept going as fast as ever, but the machine kept going too. So here's a picture of the machine and John Henry. Sweat poured down John Henry's face, and the handle of his hammer and Little Bill's drill grew red hot, so Polly Ann poured cool jugs of water over them to keep them going. and on they went with the steam drill just ahead. The sun began to sink in the sky. In the dark tunnel, John Henry turned to Little Bill and sang out, "A man ain't nothing but a man, and before I let this machine beat me, I'll die with a hammer in my hand. That steam drill's still up ahead, but I'll keep swinging till I'm dead. And as this here hammer just won't do, go on, reach on down and hand me two. Yeah, reach on down, Little Bill. Yeah, reach on down and hand me two." So Little Bill handed him two 20-pound hammers, and with one in either hand, John Henry started swinging. He swung those hammers so fast his arms became a blur. The rock crumbled and melted away before him. His great hammer strokes rang down the tunnel, and slowly John Henry and Little Bill began to pull even with the new steam drill. Finally, the men in the machine were neck and neck. Suddenly, the machine started to cough and wheeze. Just as John Henry and Little Bill pulled ahead, the steam drill started chugging and shaking. Then it choked and died. John Henry had won the race, but even then he didn't stop. He just kept right on going. A few minutes later, there was a great splintering sound and slivers of rock flew all around. Bright golden light came pouring into the black tunnel. John Henry had broken through to the other side of the mountain. The Big Bend tunnel was finished. John Henry stood there for a moment, staring at the last rays of the setting sun. Then as the crowd started cheering wildly, he turned and waved at his friends. Polly Ann rushed towards him, but before she could hug him, John Henry stumbled and fell to his knees. "Get him a doctor," the track foreman shouted, but John Henry shook his head. Then he looked up at his Polly Ann. "I said that hammer was going to be the death of me one day," he whispered. "Just make sure they write on my grave that I was a steel-driving man." And taking his Polly Ann's hand, John Henry breathed his last. The task had been too much for even his great heart, and so it was that John Henry died, still holding a hammer in his hand. Polly Ann had him buried right there at the mouth of the Big Bend tunnel, and on his tombstone she had written just what he'd asked: "Here lies a steel-driving man." Although John Henry is gone, you can still hear him and his hammer singing all across this land. Whenever you hear a train rolling across the wide countryside or howling through a dark tunnel, listen. Whenever you hear train wheels squealing against those big steel rails or a train whistle blowing at the midnight moon, listen, and you will hear the song of John Henry. So that's the end of our story about John Henry. And I hope you enjoyed it and were able to learn a little bit more about that American legend and compare the story that you heard from our storybook as well as the story that we heard in this ballad of John Henry. So I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next week. Bye.